Amateur Traveler is in its 20th year now, but can you imagine if I had people on the show who had never been to the destination but had just read about it or seen a movie about it? That wouldn't make any sense at all, and you wouldn't listen. We all know how important it is to receive advice from people who know a destination to get the most authentic local experience. And a great option for experiencing this is Explore Worldwide and their authentic small group adventures, led by local tour leaders, perfect for solo travelers who want to meet like minded people with a desire for adventure. I'm often an independent traveler, but two of my last three trips were with small group tours because they organize everything and it's a lot easier. If you want to recreate the tour I did to Malta, they have a Malta and Gozo Discovery Tour. I'm intrigued by one of their tours called A Taste of Sicily. The company again is Explore Worldwide, and visit exploreworldwide.com to learn more. And thanks to Explore Worldwide for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler. The nights are long, the days are short, and the weather is chilly to downright cold, depending on where you are. It's a good time to slip into a Quince iconic Mongolian cashmere sweaters, which start at only $50. You can treat yourself to everyday luxury at an affordable price with Quince. If you really want to dive into luxury, you can check out their leather handbags, washable silk shirts, and European linen sheet sets. Whatever you're looking for at Quince, all the prices are 50 to 80% less than similar brands, and they do that by partnering directly with top factories and cutting out the middleman. They only work with factories that use safe, ethical, and responsible manufacturing processes. And of course, they use premium fabrics and finishes for that luxury feel in every piece. But you've already heard me rave about my Quince travel pants. Treat yourself this winter without the luxury price tag. Go to quince.com/traveler for 365-day returns plus free shipping on your order. That's QUINCE.com/traveler to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/traveler. And thanks to Quince for sponsoring this episode of Amateur Traveler.
Got my bags packed, I'm on a roll. I'm heading out there and I'm ready to go. I'm looking real good in my passport photo. Oh, no.
Amateur Traveler, episode 323. Today, the Amateur Traveler visits a small, green, lake-filled former superpower, which, of course, can only mean Lithuania.
Got to sit in one more cafe. I know that I should be heading home, but maybe not today.
Welcome to the Amateur Traveler. I'm your host, Chris Christensen. Before we get into this week's interview, I do have three news stories for you. The first one is a story that actually is coming from January of last year. Apparently, an Air Canada pilot took emergency measures because he thought he had an imminent mid-air collision and rapidly descended his plane, actually injuring 16 passengers and crew. And what he thought was another plane turned out to be the planet Venus, which it turns out was several million miles away. And then, speaking of bad moves for airlines, Spirit Air, never one to shy away from controversy, has a new ad that is taking advantage of the hype surrounding a scandal where U.S. Secret Service agents and military personnel had taken 21 prostitutes to a Cartagena hotel in Colombia. Their new ad for going to Colombia? More bang for your buck. But in better marketing moves, I was very pleased to see that one of my favorite cruise lines may be coming back, or at least one of their ships is coming back into service. A Florida entrepreneur has bought the Mandalay, which is a sailing ship formerly part of the Windjammer Barefoot Cruises. It was actually built as a private yacht in 1923 for E.F. Hutton. It will soon again be plying the waters of the Caribbean, carrying passengers on a sailing cruise. For links to all three of those stories, check out the show notes at amateurtraveler.com. I'd like to welcome to the show Katie Aune from Katie Going Global, who has come to talk to us about Lithuania. Katie, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, Lithuania is not a big travel spot. In fact, it took me a little while to find somebody who could talk about Lithuania. So why did you end up in Lithuania?
Well, I actually ended up in Lithuania as part of a year of traveling through countries of the former Soviet Union. And so being a former Soviet country, Lithuania was on the list. But I soon discovered there was a lot more to Lithuania than just being part of the former Soviet bloc.
Excellent. And if someone were to follow in your footsteps and go to Lithuania, what kind of itinerary would you recommend for them?
Well, Vilnius is the capital, and I actually spent most of my time in Vilnius. I was there in December, and so a lot of the natural attractions in Lithuania weren't quite as attractive in the winter months. But Vilnius itself, I think, out of the three Baltic states, out of Tallinn in Estonia, Riga in Latvia, and then you have Vilnius in Lithuania. I think Vilnius really has probably the most to offer. It's one of the largest old town areas in Europe and really has a lot of character to it. And I think one of the things people don't necessarily realize is that Lithuania was once sort of a European superpower back in the 1400s. It was actually the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and then they eventually partnered with Poland. So it really has a fascinating history, and you get a real good sense of that in some of the surrounding areas.
And I would say I'm a student of history, and yet Lithuania superpower are two words that I have never put together.
I don't think you're alone in that respect.
And I am a little remiss here, we should put it on the map too for those of us who are geography challenged. Where would we find Lithuania?
Sure. Lithuania is toward the northern part of Europe. It's got a small coastline on the Baltic Sea, but it borders Poland, Latvia, and Belarus.
Excellent. And so you were there in the wintertime, first of all, which it sounds like you wouldn't necessarily recommend as the best time to go to Lithuania.
Probably not the best time. I certainly found plenty to do.
Mm-hmm.
The weather was relatively mild. Temperature-wise, it hadn't started snowing yet at all. I had a few sunny days, a few rainy days. I think probably the ideal time to visit Lithuania is probably in the summer, spring, and fall. Some of the things I didn't get to experience were some of the national parks, and I think they have about 4,000 lakes in the country, so a lot of opportunities. If you're into kayaking, canoeing, bird watching, those types of things are great in the spring, summer, and fall months.
Okay. So focusing in on Vilnius, what would you recommend that we see in that capital city?
One of the things, and it feels a little weird to name it as a highlight, but it was probably one of the most interesting places that I visited, was the Museum of Genocide Victims, which is actually, it's housed in a former KGB building that the KGB utilized right up until 1991 when the Soviet Union disintegrated. And they really have a very interesting exhibition detailing Lithuania's history from the 1930s all the way up through its independence in 1991, both of Nazi occupation and then Soviet occupation. And then in the basement, they've actually maintained the KGB prison exactly as it was when the building was vacated in 1991. So you have a chance to see the interrogation rooms, solitary confinement room. There's a very, very sparse backyard area where prisoners were taken to be exercised. So it's really, it's a somber experience, but I think it was one of the most interesting places that I visited in Vilnius. I think one of the other interesting things that I did in Vilnius, the tourist office there actually offers an audio guide of the entire city. So it's similar to the type of audio guide that you would pick up in a museum, has numbers for different sites, but they have actually put one together for the entire city that takes you through about 90 different stops in the Old Town area.
And you rent that, or?
Yeah, if you rent that, you pay a deposit that you get back, and then the fee is fairly small. I want to say about 10 euros or so. But they offer a 72-hour city card that includes entrance to multiple museums. And if you get the city card, the audio guide is included in that for free.
Okay.
And that was really highlighted a lot of sort of interesting stories, urban legends, things that you probably wouldn't find out any other way. And for an independent traveler, it was really the perfect way to go around the city because you were getting the benefit of a guided tour and all of the commentary, but you could go at your own pace. So I was able to take a break when I wanted and get a snack, maybe take a little detour to see something, and then just hop right back on to the tour and continue along.
Excellent. And the level of detail you found to be a good level? I could think of like the Prague Cathedral had a little more detail than we needed sometimes in the audio guide.
Yeah, they actually set it up perfectly because they gave you the option to get more detail if you wanted. So,
excellent.
for example, there was one church where you stopped in front of and it gave you very quick overview, and then say push number 1, 2, 3 if you want to hear more about the legend associated with this church. So there were several instances where you had that option. You could hear the basic detail, but then if you wanted to go more in depth, you had that option.
Excellent. And on that tour, what were a few places that you wouldn't have known about if you hadn't taken that tour that you found interesting?
Well, several of the churches that it went by certainly were on the list of places to see, but I wouldn't have really known much about what their importance was or why I should be seeing them. There was another stop that went through what was formerly the Jewish ghetto area of Vilnius and some of the streets associated with the Jewish ghetto that really don't have any marking or anything identifying them right now. So I think that's something that I probably wouldn't have come across. And then it also went up to a nice area where there's some ruins being reconstructed that offer a really nice view over the entire city. And it was sort of in an area kind of off to the side of the old town that I don't think I would have discovered otherwise.
Okay, interesting. What surprised you about Lithuania?
I was surprised at how Western it felt.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I think people think of Lithuania and the other Baltic states as former Soviet republics, but the theme that really came to me as I traveled, not just in Lithuania, but in Estonia and Latvia as well, is that the whole time they were part of the Soviet Union, they really felt that they were being occupied by the
Mm-hmm.
Soviets.
Yeah.
They never really felt a Soviet identity. And so their Lithuanian identity is very strong. And the Polish influence is fairly strong as well because they were aligned with Poland for many years back in the 14, 15, 1600s.
And that probably means they're a Catholic nation historically.
Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Yes. And so I think, you know, I didn't really feel like I was in Eastern Europe. There was a lot of English being spoken. English was very common. A lot of the museums I went to, they had explanations, not just in Lithuanian English, but also Russian, German, Polish. So very multilingual and very diverse.
Okay. And I don't know if you had a chance to see what the guidebooks were recommending for Lithuania. Were you using a particular guidebook for your trip?
I did. I used the Lonely Planet
Mm-hmm.
Guide to Eastern Europe, which has fairly small sections.
It's a fairly small country.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. The way that it was written, I don't think there was anything that they really oversold.
Okay.
Vilnius definitely has its share of museums. I actually visited, I think, 8 museums over a 72-hour period because I took advantage of the 72-hour pass
Oh, okay.
that he offers. And none of them are huge. I mean, I easily got through some of them in half an hour. Some were more interesting than others. You know, I think if you're expecting something like the Louvre or the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, you'll be disappointed. But for the size of the city and for what the museums had to offer, you know, I thought it was a good value. Everything is still pretty low priced in terms of entrance fees. So it's a good value for what you get.
And with the 8 museums, that's a mix of history museums and art museums, or what kind of museums were
Yeah,
covered?
they had really a good variety. I went to, like I mentioned before, the Museum of Genocide Victims. They also, their national museum is split into what they call the Old Arsenal and the New Arsenal.
Mm-hmm.
And those really focus more on history. The Old Arsenal actually goes all the way back to prehistoric times and really focuses on the development of Lithuanian culture. And then the New Arsenal focuses a little bit more recent, talks about some of the rural lifestyle in Lithuania. And that was actually, it wasn't a large museum, but they had, one of the things I was most impressed with was they had brochures that you could take with you in multiple languages, explaining, for example, the Lithuanian tradition of cross crafting, which is very big in rural areas.
And I don't know what that is.
Basically making crosses.
Okay. All right. That's what I would interpret that phrase to be, but
Yeah.
wooden carved crosses?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And actually, that's sort of a nice lead into, I think, one of the most interesting things that I saw in Lithuania, which was the Hill of Crosses, which is about 3.5 hours outside of Vilnius, closer to the border with Latvia, actually. And it's a hill, not a high hill, but a hill with about 100,000 crosses
Oh, my goodness.
planted.
Crucifixes or crosses or a mixture of the two?
Really all over the board. Some are large, some are small. They think that people started planting crosses there sometime in the 1800s, and it just sort of took off. A lot of them are memorial crosses. You'll see a lot with people's names on them and their dates of death.
But it's not a graveyard. They're not
Memorial.
there. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And actually, during Soviet times, the Soviets tried to raise the hill several times, and people just kept coming back and kept putting the crosses back.
Interesting. Yeah, where religion is outlawed, I could see that would be a point of contention, let's say.
Exactly. Exactly. But now they estimate 100,000 crosses. When I was there, the ones I saw were from all over the world. I saw some from the United States. I saw one from a family. I think it was the Brzezinski family from Southern Illinois. There were some from Buenos Aires, from other places in Europe. So really all over the board, people, and they have an area nearby where you can buy crosses and write on them and add them to the hill yourself.
Interesting. Who was the most memorable local you met in your travels, sir?
I met a woman. I took part in an excursion into a Soviet bunker, which was an interesting story in itself. From that excursion, it was outside of Vilnius, and I got a ride back to Vilnius with a woman, and her name is escaping me right now, but she was probably in her late 20s or early 30s. She really impressed me with how knowledgeable she was about Lithuanian history. It put me to shame comparing to how much I know about U.S. history. But it was impressive how much pride she had in her country and how much she knew about it. And she was eager. Unfortunately, our schedules didn't mesh the rest of the time that I was there, so we weren't able to meet up again. But she volunteered to get together with me and show me around, and very eager to show off Lithuania.
And besides a little Lithuanian history, anything you wish you had known before you went?
Not really. I think I went in with very few preconceived notions about the country. So everything was very new to me. And I think that allowed me to really soak in the atmosphere and the history and really look at everything with an open mind.
Okay. Now, you said it felt very familiar, it felt very Western to you.
Mm-hmm.
Were there two moments, one of which felt most like home and one of which felt furthest from home?
The most like home was probably just the fact that they had a McDonald's.
Okay.
You get off of the train station and right there on the corner is a McDonald's, which I always sort of, I don't know, I cringe a little bit when I see that because I like visiting places without McDonald's.
Okay. There goes my McDonald's sponsorship right there.
You can edit that out. I think the furthest from home was this excursion that I did into a Soviet bunker, which basically was sort of a theatrical recreation that I learned about when I got to Vilnius. And it took place actually in an abandoned bunker, I think about 20 or 30 kilometers outside of Vilnius in the middle of a wooded area. And everyone who participated basically played the role of a former Soviet citizen. And so we were ushered in and out of rooms and up and down stairs, and we had Soviet officers barking at us in Russian. We had to do a drill wearing gas masks. We were in an interrogation room where people were getting scolded and handcuffed, and it was really surreal. I knew in my head that it wasn't real, but it was still a little scary.
Interesting. Any recommendations on places to stay or places to eat?
Places to stay, I actually stayed a few nights in a hotel and a few nights in a hostel. The hotel I stayed at was called the Domus Maria Hotel, and I think the location is great. It's near what are called the Gates of Dawn, which is one of the main entrances to the Old Town area. It's just inside the Old Town, but at the same time, it's within walking distance to the train station and the bus station. So it's really a great location, reasonably priced. I think probably the only downside was that their Wi-Fi connection was a little sketchy at times. But the staff was very friendly. The breakfast was good in the morning, and the location couldn't be beat. And then I also stayed at the Fortuna Hostel, which is located just outside of the old town, very close to the train and bus station, probably about 5-minute walk from the old town area, but still a pretty good location. And for an Eastern European hostel, I thought it was very good. The staff was great, good facilities, very reasonably priced. I actually stayed for over a week and they offered a discount for staying longer, so that was nice.
Excellent. And then recommendations on places to eat.
I'm gluten intolerant, so I'm
Okay.
pretty limited in where I'm able to eat out. I tend to do most of my cooking in the hostel.
Is there any street food that is typical in Lithuania?
No, there's really no street food
Hmm.
to be found at all. And I really didn't see many even fast food type places. Even aside from like a McDonald's, I didn't really notice any, like Lithuanian chain
Okay.
fast food type places.
And then you mentioned you were staying by the train and bus station, so I'm gathering you're getting around on public transportation.
The old town itself, Vilnius itself, is completely walkable. I didn't actually take a bus at all within the city limits, but there are several day trips that you can do from Vilnius. The bus and the train systems in the country really are excellent and they're very reasonably priced. They have the schedules are well posted at the stations and available in the tourist office as well. One of the things I would recommend people do as a supplement or even a replacement for a guidebook is In Your Pocket offers a guide for Vilnius. And that tends to be you can either download the PDF from their website, inyourpocket.com, or sometimes the hotels actually offer the hard copies. And that usually includes a lot of the train and bus schedules
Hmm.
in it, which is really helpful. I know it included specifically schedules for some of the day trips that I did, which I found very helpful.
And speaking of day trips, you mentioned the bunker and the Hill of
Mhm.
Crosses.
Yeah.
What other day trips would you recommend?
I would recommend I took a day trip to Trakai, which was probably the closest day trip I did. I think it was under an hour to get there. And that is basically, they refer to it as a fairy tale castle. And it really does look a little bit like a fairy tale castle. It's sort of the old red brick motif. And it sits out on an extension into a lake. You see it as you're approaching, and then you have to cross a drawbridge to get to the castle. And it really, in terms of visiting castles, I think it was one of the most substantive visits. They actually had a very good museum within the castle with a lot of good exhibits detailing both the history of Trakai and the history of Lithuania. It dates back, I think, to about the 1400s. So really a neat atmosphere, and you can kind of walk all over the castle and see quite a bit of it. And the other day trip that I did was to Kaunas, which is, I want to say it's the second largest city, the second or third largest city in
Mm-hmm.
Lithuania. And that had a cute old town area as well as a nice pedestrian area. And just outside of the city, it had what's called the Ninth Fort, which is actually a fort that dates back to the 19th century that was built to fortify the Russian Tsarist Empire and then was later used as a death camp by the Nazis.
Hmm.
And so now it's been turned into a museum detailing some of that history of the Nazi occupation in Lithuania. And there's a nice memorial. About 80,000 people were killed there. And so they've got a nice memorial to the victims at that site. So Kaunas, I thought definitely worth a visit. That's about just under 2 hours by train or by bus from Vilnius.
Excellent. Before we go to wind this down, I've got a few last questions I'll ask you. Anything else we should know if we're planning a trip to Lithuania?
I know a lot of people try to combine the Baltic states
Mm-hmm.
and hit Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia all in one shot. I definitely think Lithuania has a lot more to offer. I was there nearly 2 weeks and didn't even get very far outside of Vilnius. So I think, I would recommend that people give themselves at least a week, if not more, and try not to squeeze all three of the Baltic states together because I think it's doing a bit of a disservice to all three of them, but especially Lithuania, I think it really has a lot to offer.
Excellent. If you had one picture that you really think for you captures Lithuania, what would the picture be?
I think one of my favorite pictures I took was from the top of Gediminas Hill, which is a hill in the Old Town area of Lithuania, looking down at their main cathedral and the whole city, and really just captured you can see the tops of all of the churches, which I think really reflects its religious history. And then Gediminas Hill itself is named after one of the very early founders of Vilnius, Prince Gediminas. And so I think that's probably, I'd say, what captures it the most for me.
Okay. One thing that makes you laugh and say only in Lithuania?
It's funny because there's been places that I visited where I could easily answer that question. Nothing really comes to mind about Lithuania.
Okay. All the questions don't always work.
Yeah. If you had asked me that about Armenia, I very easily could have answered.
Last two questions. Finish this sentence. You really know you're in Lithuania when what?
Probably isn't that amusing of an answer, but I think you really know you're in Lithuania when you see a mix of Lithuanian and Polish everywhere. Mm-hmm. I felt like there was much more of a Polish influence there than a Russian or a Soviet influence at all.
Okay.
And I think it really made it unique from some of the other places that I visited in the former Soviet Union.
And if you had to summarize Lithuania in just 3 words, what 3 words would you use?
Historical, nature, and friendly.
Excellent. Now, I have to ask, we've been ignoring the fact that there's a party going on during the whole interview. Why don't you tell people where you are at this time?
Well, I am in Yerevan, Armenia, and I am in a bedroom in a flat of one of the staff members at the organization where I'm volunteering, and they're holding an Easter egg painting party.
And what is the organization you're doing volunteer travel with right now?
I am volunteering with the Armenian Volunteer Corps, which actually partners with a sister organization called Birthright Armenia. So the difference is that Armenian Volunteer Corps recruits volunteers of all ages and all ethnicities, nationalities. Birthright Armenia focuses on bringing back diaspora Armenian, people who are of Armenian origin who were raised outside of the country. They focus on bringing them back to the country to volunteer. But the two organizations are very close and work together quite a bit and have a lot of overlap. They then place volunteers with different nonprofit organizations within the country.
Excellent. And if people want to read more about your travels, where can they find them?
They can read about my travels at katiegoingglobal.com. And they can also find me on Twitter at Katie Aune, which is KatieAune.
Excellent. We'll have links to both of those in the show notes. Katie, thanks so much for coming on the show and telling us about your trip to Lithuania.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Got a comment from Kathy, who's still catching up on our Amateur Traveler episodes and was listening to episode 258 on Xi'an, China. I love Xi'an, and I have visited 3 times, 1997, 2001, and 2004. I had no trouble getting into the Great Mosque in 2001 and 2004. It's wonderfully atmospheric. I would also recommend the Taoist Temple to the 8 Great Immortals. It was rather shabby in 2001, but had been renovated by 2004, unlike the Great Mosque. And Kathy also included a link to pictures from her trip. Jim commented on last week's episode on Puglia in Italy. When I lived in New York City, my favorite place in Little Italy was called Puglia's. Our secretary was from Bari. She pronounced it Badi. I didn't get to see Bari, but did get to see a lot of Puglia on Rick Steves' tour of southern Italy a few years back. We were the alpha test. It was the first time they ran the tour. We could not have been more welcome. We stayed a couple nights at Vieste, a port town on the Adriatic at the north end of Puglia, where we learned about sea caves and about strange constructs along the cliffs that looked like a fishing boat trying to escape from the cliff. I'll upload a photo. We also visited Alberobello and saw the Trulli houses and had a wine and cheese tasting there. 7 pounds gained in 13 days. It was April and still a little cool, and not everyone was ready for visitors, but it was a really fun place to visit. I enjoyed revisiting by the podcast. Thank you so much, Jim. With that, I think we'll wrap up this episode of The Amateur Traveler. I have a lot of things on my to-do list today, including getting this show out. If you have any questions, feel free to send an email to host@amateurtraveler.com, or better yet, leave a comment on this episode at amateurtraveler.com or on the Amateur Traveler community on Facebook, facebook.com/amateurtraveler. If you happen to be on iTunes, we love 5-star reviews. And as always, thanks so much for listening.